August 25, 1944, Paris. The City of Light is about to become a city of ashes. Adolf Hitler has just given a direct order to the German military governor of Paris. Destroy everything, blow up the Eiffel Tower, demolish Notre Dame Cathedral, burn the Louvre Museum with all its priceless art, detonate every bridge across the Seine, level the entire city, and leave nothing but rubble for the advancing Allied forces. It's an order that would erase 1,000 years of human civilization in a single night, and the man responsible for carrying it out, General Dietrich von Choltitz, is standing at his window overlooking the city, holding the detonator codes in his hand. But in the next few hours he's going to make a decision that will save millions of lives and preserve one of humanity's greatest cities. He's going to look at that direct order from Hitler and say no. And somehow, impossibly, he's going to survive. This is the story of how one man's act of disobedience saved Paris, and why the most vindictive dictator in modern history never made him pay for it. To understand this incredible story, we need to go back a few weeks earlier, to August 7, 1944, when Dietrich von Choltitz first arrived in Paris to take up his new command. He was 49 years old, a career military officer who had served in the German army since World War I. Von Choltitz wasn't some idealistic young officer or a secret resistance member. He was a loyal German soldier who had fought on multiple fronts during World War II. He had participated in the invasions of Poland, the Netherlands, and the Soviet Union. He had commanded troops during brutal urban combat in Sevastopol and Rotterdam. This was not a man with a history of questioning orders or showing mercy to enemy cities. In fact, von Choltitz had earned a reputation as exactly the kind of officer Hitler needed for difficult assignments. During the siege of Sevastopol in 1942, he had shown no hesitation in implementing harsh measures against both Soviet forces and civilians. In Rotterdam in 1940, he had been present during the controversial bombing that destroyed much of the city centre, though he was not directly responsible for ordering that particular attack. The point is, Hitler didn't send some soft-hearted intellectual to Paris. He sent a proven commander who had demonstrated his willingness to follow orders, no matter how difficult. Von Choltitz arrived in Paris at one of the most critical moments of the entire war. Just 2 months earlier, on June 6th, the Allies had landed at Normandy. The invasion that Hitler had feared for years had finally come, and it was going far better for the Allies than the Germans had hoped. By early August, American, British, and Canadian forces were pushing inland, liberating town after town across northern France. The German army was in retreat, and Paris, the crown jewel of Nazi-occupied France, was now directly in the path of the advancing Allied armies. But Paris wasn't just any city. For 4 years, from 1940 to 1944, it had been the headquarters of the German occupation of France. Nazi officers had walked the streets of the Champs-Élysées. German soldiers had guarded the Arc de Triomphe. Hitler himself had visited in 1940, posing for photographs in front of the Eiffel Tower, in what he considered one of his greatest triumphs. Paris represented something deeply symbolic for the Nazi regime. It was proof that Germany had conquered the heart of European civilization. Losing Paris wouldn't just be a military defeat, it would be a psychological catastrophe, and Hitler knew it. By August 1944, the Führer was not the confident conqueror of 1940. The war had turned decisively against Germany. The Soviets were pushing from the east, having already liberated much of their territory, and pushing into Poland. The Allies were advancing from the west. Italy had already fallen. Germany's cities were being bombed day and night by British and American aircraft. Hitler's grand vision of a 1,000-year Reich was collapsing after just 12 years. And he was becoming increasingly unstable, paranoid and desperate. This is the Hitler that von Choltitz encountered when he was summoned for a personal meeting before taking up his command in Paris. The encounter took place at Hitler's headquarters in East Prussia, and von Choltitz later described it as deeply unsettling. The man he met was not the charismatic leader who had captivated millions in the 1930s. This Hitler was physically deteriorating, prone to sudden rages, and making increasingly irrational decisions. His left hand trembled uncontrollably, possibly due to Parkinson's disease or the effects of the numerous medications his doctors were giving him. His eyes had a wild, unfocused quality, and his strategic thinking had devolved into a simple, brutal philosophy. If Germany couldn't have these territories, no one would. During that meeting, Hitler made his intentions clear. Paris was not to fall into Allied hands intact. If the German forces had to withdraw, they were to implement a scorched earth policy, destroy everything of military value, blow up the bridges, the power stations, the railways. But Hitler went further. He wanted the historic monuments destroyed too. The Eiffel Tower, which had become a symbol of French resistance, was to be demolished. The grand museums, the cathedrals, the palaces, all of it was to be reduced to rubble. Hitler even had a specific vision for what Paris should look like after the destruction. A field of ruins, he said, that would serve as a monument to German fury and a warning to anyone who dared oppose the Third Reich. Von Choltitz was given explicit orders, documented in writing and reinforced verbally. When he asked what should happen to Paris's civilian population, estimated at around 3 million people at the time, Hitler's response was chilling. They were French. They were the enemy. Their fate was of no concern. The implication was clear. If millions of Parisian civilians died in the destruction, that was acceptable collateral damage. Perhaps it was even desirable, as it would slow down the Allied advance and create a humanitarian crisis that would tie up resources. So von Choltitz traveled to Paris with these orders in his briefcase and took up residence in the Hotel Meurice, the luxury hotel on the Rue de Rivoli that served as the German military headquarters. From his office windows he could see the Tuileries Garden, the Louvre Museum just beyond, and in the distance the Eiffel Tower rising above the city skyline. And he began to prepare for the systematic destruction of one of the world's most beautiful cities. The preparations were extensive and thorough. German engineers began placing explosive charges in all the major bridges across the Seine. The Pont Neuf, the oldest bridge in Paris, dating back to 1607, was wired with dynamite. So was the Pont Alexandre III, with its ornate Art Nouveau lamps and golden statues. The modern concrete bridges that carried crucial traffic were prepared for demolition. In total, von Choltitz's engineers prepared 24 bridges for destruction. But the bridges were just the beginning. Explosive charges were placed in the Eiffel Tower's structural supports, positioned to bring the entire iron lattice structure crashing down. The Palais Garnier Opera House, with its stunning architecture and Marc Chagall ceiling painting, was rigged to blow. The Luxembourg Palace, seat of the French Senate, was prepared for demolition. Notre Dame Cathedral, the Gothic masterpiece that had stood for over 800 years, had charges placed around its foundations. Even the Louvre Museum, home to the Mona Lisa, the Venus de Milo, and countless other irreplaceable works of art, was wired for destruction. The military targets were prepared as well. The Gare de Lyon railway station, crucial for transportation, was ready to be demolished. Power plants throughout the city were rigged to explode. Water treatment facilities were prepared for destruction. Fuel depots were set to be ignited. If all these plans were executed, Paris wouldn't just be damaged. It would be uninhabitable. 3 million people would be left without water, electricity, transportation, or shelter. The death toll would be catastrophic. Von Choltitz had about 20,000 German troops under his command in and around Paris, along with elements of the SS and Gestapo. He had tanks, artillery, and plenty of ammunition. He had the demolition charges in place. He had the written orders from Hitler. Everything was ready. The only thing he needed was to give the command. But as August progressed and the Allied forces drew closer to Paris, something began to change in von Choltitz's mind. It started with small things. Walking through the streets of Paris in the early morning, before most Parisians were awake, von Choltitz found himself noticing details he had overlooked during his first weeks in the city. The way sunlight caught the Seine at dawn, the architectural details on the buildings lining the boulevards, the sense of history that permeated every street and square. This wasn't just a city. It was a testament to human creativity and achievement spanning centuries. The Romans had built here. Medieval craftsmen had raised the great cathedral. Renaissance and Baroque architects had designed the grand palaces. Generations of artists, writers, and thinkers had made Paris their home. Von Choltitz also began interacting more with Parisians themselves. Unlike some German officers who remained isolated in their headquarters, von Choltitz occasionally walked through the city, visited restaurants, observed daily life. What he saw were not the faceless enemies of Nazi propaganda, but ordinary people trying to survive an occupation. Mothers taking their children to school, shopkeepers opening their stores, old men sitting in cafes reading newspapers, lovers walking hand in hand along the Seine. The humanity of Paris began to weigh on him in a way that the humanity of Sevastopol or Rotterdam apparently had not. There was also the French resistance to consider. The resistance had been growing stronger throughout 1944, emboldened by news of the Allied invasion. By mid-August, resistance fighters were becoming increasingly bold, attacking German patrols, sabotaging communications, and preparing for a general uprising. Von Choltitz knew that if he began destroying the city, the resistance would fight back with everything they had. The destruction of Paris would turn into a brutal urban battle that would kill thousands, possibly tens of thousands, of civilians. The carnage would be immense. But perhaps most importantly, von Choltitz began to think about what would happen after the war. By August 1944, any realistic assessment of the military situation made it clear that Germany was going to lose. It was just a question of when, not if. The Soviets were pushing from the east. The Western Allies were pushing from the west. Germany was being squeezed in a vice, and there was no realistic path to victory. Hitler might rage about wonder weapons and turning the tide, but professional military officers like von Choltitz could read a map and do the math. If Germany was going to lose, what would happen to the officers who had followed Hitler's most extreme orders? The Nuremberg trials hadn't happened yet, but von Choltitz could imagine that there would be some kind of reckoning. And the officer who destroyed Paris, who demolished the Eiffel Tower and Notre Dame, who left 3 million civilians to die in the ruins, that officer would be remembered as one of history's great monsters. His name would be synonymous with barbarism and cultural destruction for centuries to come. Von Choltitz also had to think about his family. He was married with 3 children. What would their lives be like if their father went down in history as the man who destroyed Paris? Would they ever be able to escape that legacy? Would his children be able to hold their heads up in public, or would they forever carry the shame of what their father had done? These thoughts were weighing on von Choltitz when, on August 19, 1944, the situation in Paris suddenly became critical. The French resistance, sensing that liberation was near, launched a general uprising. Resistance fighters seized control of police stations, government buildings, and key intersections throughout the city. Barricades went up in the streets. The tricolour flag of France appeared on buildings that had flown the Nazi swastika for 4 years. The battle for Paris had begun. Von Choltitz had the military power to crush the uprising. He could have ordered his tanks into the streets, his artillery to shell the resistance strongholds, his troops to go door to door eliminating fighters. It would have been brutal, but it was within his capabilities. And in fact, Hitler was sending him increasingly frantic messages demanding exactly that. Crush the uprising. Show no mercy. Destroy the city if necessary. Berlin wanted Paris turned into a battlefield, and if the city burned in the process, so much the better. But von Choltitz hesitated. Instead of ordering an all-out assault, he agreed to a temporary ceasefire negotiated by the Swedish Consul General Raoul Nordling. Nordling, who had been working desperately to prevent bloodshed, managed to convince von Choltitz to hold back his forces for a few days. Von Choltitz claimed he was doing this to avoid unnecessary German casualties and to maintain some order in the city, but in reality, he was stalling. He was buying time, waiting to see if the Allied forces would arrive before he had to make a final decision about whether to follow Hitler's orders. The phone calls from Berlin became more insistent. Hitler himself called on August 23rd, demanding to know why Paris hadn't been destroyed yet. Why were the bridges still standing? Why hadn't the Eiffel Tower been demolished? Von Choltitz gave vague answers about military necessity, about maintaining routes for German forces to retreat, about the need to keep order until the last possible moment. But Hitler wasn't fooled. He knew von Choltitz was stalling, and he was furious. Hitler sent his most infamous order on August 23rd, a message that has been preserved in the historical record. Paris must not fall into enemy hands, or if it does, only as a field of ruins. The order was explicit and direct. There was no room for interpretation. Von Koltitz was to demolish Paris or face the consequences. And the consequences for disobeying Hitler were well known. Officers who failed to follow orders were court-martialed and executed. Their families were sometimes punished as well, sent to concentration camps or executed as a lesson to others who might consider disobedience. Von Koltitz stood at a crossroads. He could follow orders, destroy Paris, ensure the deaths of countless thousands of people, and forever be remembered as a monster. Or he could disobey, save the city, and almost certainly face execution along with potential harm to his family. It was an impossible choice. But on August 24th, as Allied forces drew closer to the city, von Koltitz made his decision. He ordered his engineers to disarm the explosives. The charges on the bridges were removed. The dynamite at the Eiffel Tower was disconnected. The bombs placed throughout the city's monuments and infrastructure were neutralized, and when General Philippe Leclerc's French 2nd Armored Division entered Paris on August 25, 1944, they found the bridges intact, the monuments standing, and the city alive. Von Koltitz surrendered at the Hotel Meurice, and Paris, the City of Light, had been saved. The liberation of Paris was one of the most joyous moments in the history of World War II. Thousands of Parisians poured into the streets, weeping, cheering, embracing the Allied soldiers who had freed them. Church bells that had been silent for 4 years rang out across the city. French flags appeared on every building. General Charles de Gaulle, leader of the Free French forces, marched triumphantly down the Champs-Élysées. It was a moment of pure celebration, a victory not just for the Allies, but for civilization itself. And Dietrich von Koltitz, instead of going down in history as the butcher of Paris, became known as the savior of the city. He was taken as a prisoner of war, held in Britain and then the United States for several years, and eventually released in 1947. He returned to Germany, where he lived quietly until his death in 1966. He was never prosecuted for war crimes. In fact, he was treated with a degree of respect for his decision to spare Paris. But here's the crucial question. Why didn't Hitler execute him? Von Koltitz directly disobeyed the Führer's explicit orders. He saved a city that Hitler wanted destroyed. He defied the man who had sent thousands to their deaths for far lesser offenses. So why did von Koltitz survive? The answer is both simple and complicated. Von Koltitz survived because by the time Hitler learned that Paris had been liberated intact, it was too late to do anything about it. Von Koltitz was already in Allied custody. He was a prisoner of war beyond Hitler's reach. If he had still been in German-controlled territory when his disobedience became known, he almost certainly would have been arrested and executed. But the speed of the Allied advance and von Koltitz's quick surrender meant that he was safely in custody before Hitler could order his arrest. There's also evidence that von Koltitz had some protection from other German officers who shared his reluctance to destroy Paris. General Alfred Jodl, one of Hitler's top military advisors, may have deliberately delayed or softened some of Hitler's most extreme orders regarding Paris. Other officers in the chain of command may have turned a blind eye to von Koltitz's stalling tactics, recognizing that destroying Paris served no military purpose and would only add to Germany's already terrible legacy. But we also need to be honest about von Koltitz's motivations and his legacy. After the war, von Koltitz and his supporters crafted a narrative that portrayed him as a hero who had always intended to save Paris, who had courageously defied Hitler from the beginning. The truth is more complicated. Von Koltitz did prepare the city for destruction. He did order the explosive charges to be placed. He did participate in the occupation of Paris and the repression of the French resistance. His decision to spare the city came late, possibly only in the final days before liberation, and may have been motivated as much by self-preservation and fear of post-war justice as by any moral epiphany. Some historians have also questioned whether Hitler ever seriously intended for Paris to be completely destroyed, or whether the orders were more about psychological pressure and scorched-earth military tactics than actual cultural annihilation. The documentary evidence is clear that Hitler issued the orders, but it's less clear how much he expected them to be carried out versus how much was rhetoric and rage from a dictator losing control of his empire. What we can say with certainty is that Paris survived intact, and Dietrich von Koltitz played a role in that survival. Whether he was a hero, a pragmatist, or simply a man who made one good decision after a career of following terrible orders, is something historians still debate. What's not debatable is that his decision, whatever motivated it, saved countless lives and preserved irreplaceable cultural treasures. The story of Paris's liberation also reveals something important about the nature of resistance under totalitarian regimes. We often imagine resistance as dramatic, public acts of defiance, underground movements, sabotage, armed rebellion. But sometimes resistance is quieter. It's a general who stalls and delays and finds excuses not to follow orders. It's a bureaucrat who loses paperwork or misunderstands directives. It's a soldier who aims badly or retreats faster than necessary. These small acts of non-compliance, when multiplied across thousands of individuals, can significantly undermine even the most brutal regime. Von Choltitz's story also highlights the impossible choices that individuals faced in Nazi Germany and occupied territories. We judge historical figures from the comfort of the present, knowing how the story ends, with all the moral clarity that comes from hindsight. But in August 1944, von Choltitz didn't know for certain that the war would end in just 9 months. He didn't know that Hitler would commit suicide in his bunker. He didn't know that Germany would be divided and occupied. He was making decisions in real time, under enormous pressure, with incomplete information, and with his own life and the lives of his family potentially at stake. This doesn't excuse his earlier actions or his participation in the Nazi war machine. Von Choltitz was not a resistance fighter or a secret opponent of the regime. For most of the war, he was a loyal officer who carried out his orders, even when those orders involved urban warfare and harsh treatment of occupied populations. His decision to save Paris came late, and it may have been driven more by pragmatism than principle. But in that one crucial moment, when he stood at his window overlooking Paris with the power to destroy it all, he chose mercy over obedience. He chose preservation over destruction. He chose to be remembered as the man who saved Paris rather than the man who destroyed it. And that choice, whatever motivated it, matters. Today, you can still walk across the Pont Neuf and the Pont Alexandre thread. You can still climb the Eiffel Tower and gaze out over the city. You can still visit Notre Dame, though it's currently under reconstruction after the tragic fire of 2019 that had nothing to do with war. You can still see the Mona Lisa in the Louvre, still attend performances at the Palais Garnier, still walk the same streets that Hemingway and Fitzgerald and Hugo once walked. All of this exists because one man, at one crucial moment, said no. The question of why Hitler didn't execute von Choltitz is, in the end, less important than the fact that Paris survived. Von Choltitz escaped punishment partly through luck, partly through the protection of other officers, and partly because events moved too quickly for Hitler to retaliate. But regardless of why he survived, the city he saved continues to stand as one of humanity's great achievements, a testament to centuries of human creativity, culture, and civilization. There's a broader lesson here about the power of individual choice, even in the most oppressive circumstances. Von Choltitz had every reason to follow orders. He was a career military officer in an authoritarian regime. He had already demonstrated his willingness to participate in harsh military actions. His own safety and that of his family depended on obedience. The entire structure of Nazi Germany was built on the principle of absolute obedience to the Führer's will. Yet in the end, he chose differently. We'll never know exactly what went through von Choltitz's mind in those final days before Paris's liberation. Did he have a genuine moral awakening? Was he calculating his post-war prospects? Was he simply war-weary and unable to bring himself to commit one more atrocity? Was it some combination of all these factors? The historical record gives us his actions, but can only hint at his motivations. What we do know is that Paris, a city of nearly 3 million people in 1944, was spared the fate of cities like Warsaw, which was systematically destroyed by the Germans, or Dresden, which was devastated by Allied bombing. The cultural heritage accumulated over more than 2,000 years of human habitation remained intact. The art, the architecture, the monuments, the very fabric of one of the world's great cities survived. When von Choltitz died in 1966, his obituaries were mixed. Some called him the savior of Paris. Others pointed out his earlier actions during the war and questioned whether one act of mercy could redeem a career of military service to a genocidal regime. His own memoirs, published after the war, painted him as more heroic than the evidence fully supports. But whatever his true motivations and whatever his full legacy, the facts remain. He had the power to destroy Paris. He had direct orders to do so from the highest authority in Nazi Germany, and he chose not to follow those orders. The story of Dietrich von Choltitz and the salvation of Paris reminds us that history is made by individual choices, not just by great forces and inevitable trends. It reminds us that even in the most constrained circumstances, moral agency exists. It reminds us that courage can take many forms, including the courage to simply refuse to commit an act of destruction, even when powerful people are commanding you to do so. And perhaps most importantly, it reminds us of the value of what von Choltitz chose to preserve. Paris isn't just buildings and bridges, it's a symbol of human achievement, of our ability to create beauty, to build communities, to make spaces that inspire and uplift the human spirit. When we visit Paris today, when we walk along the Seine or stand before Notre Dame or climb the Eiffel Tower, we're experiencing something that almost didn't exist. We're enjoying a gift that was nearly lost, saved by one man's last-minute decision to disobey. The photograph of von Choltitz surrendering at the Hotel Meurice shows a tired, middle-aged man in a rumpled uniform, his face showing the strain of those final weeks. He doesn't look like a hero. He doesn't look like a villain. He looks like what he was, an ordinary man who found himself in an extraordinary situation and in the end made the right choice. Not perfectly, not without hesitation, not without being complicit in many wrong choices before that moment. But when it mattered most, when the fate of a great city hung in the balance, he chose preservation over destruction. So why didn't Hitler execute the German officer who refused to burn a city? The simple answer is that by the time Hitler knew about the disobedience, von Choltitz was already beyond his reach, protected by Allied custody and the speed of events. But the deeper answer is that even Hitler's power had limits. Even totalitarian control has gaps. Even the most fearsome dictator can't punish every act of disobedience if events move quickly enough, and if there are people willing to shelter the disobedient. Von Choltitz survived not because he was particularly heroic or because Hitler showed mercy. He survived through a combination of timing, luck, and the protection of others who also had doubts about destroying Paris. And because of his survival, and more importantly because of his choice not to destroy the city, millions of people today can still experience one of humanity's great urban treasures. The next time you see a photograph of the Eiffel Tower or the Seine at sunset, remember that it almost wasn't there. Remember that it existed after 1944 because one man, however flawed, however complicit in other crimes, made one crucial choice when it mattered most. And remember that in every generation, in every circumstance, individuals face moments when they must choose between obedience and conscience, between following orders and following their humanity. The story of Dietrich von Choltitz and the salvation of Paris is a reminder that those choices matter, that they have consequences that echo through history, and that even in the darkest times, it's possible to choose the light.